Part 1. The moment everything changed. The delivery room was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of my life. I had imagined it so many times. Eric standing by my side, holding my hand, tears streaming down his face as he laid eyes on our baby for the first time. I pictured us exchanging smiles, the kind only two people who had created a life together could share. But reality was a nightmare I never could have imagined. The labor had been long and grueling, but as soon as I heard the baby's first cries, it was like the world stopped. My heart swelled with love, and I turned to Eric, hoping to share the moment. "It's a girl," the nurse announced, her voice full of joy. My first instinct was to smile, tears spilling down my cheeks. A girl. My daughter. She was beautiful, with a full head of dark hair and tiny fingers that clenched the air as if searching for me already. I wanted to hold her, to tell her that I loved her more than anything in the world. But Eric's reaction wasn't what I expected. I looked at him, expecting pride or at least relief. Instead, his face twisted into a look I'd never seen before. Disappointment. Anger. "A girl," he said, his voice sharp and cold. "Yes, a girl," I said, trying to bridge the gap to pull him into the moment. "She's beautiful, Eric. Look at her." But he didn't look at her. He didn't even glance in her direction. Instead, he stepped back, his jaw clenching. "I told you I wanted a boy," he muttered, his voice barely audible but heavy with resentment. The nurse, holding our daughter in her arms, froze for a moment before gently asking, "Would you like to hold her, Dad?" He didn't answer. He turned his back and walked out of the room without a word. I sat there in stunned silence, my arms instinctively reaching for my baby as the nurse gently handed her to me. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. I kissed her tiny forehead, whispering, "It's okay, sweet girl. I've got you. Mommy's here." But inside my heart was breaking. What had just happened? Why couldn't Eric see how perfect she was? I told myself he was just overwhelmed, that he needed time to process. I wanted to believe that once he held her, everything would change. But the truth was there, plain as day, in his absence. As the hours passed and Eric didn't return, the reality of the situation began to sink in. I was alone. My husband, the man I had loved and trusted, had just walked out on me in one of the most vulnerable moments of my life. All because we had a daughter instead of a son. When the nurse came back to check on me, she asked if I wanted to call anyone. I shook my head, embarrassed to admit that the one person I should have been able to rely on had abandoned me. That night, as I held my newborn daughter in my arms, I whispered promises to her. "I'll love you enough for both of us. I'll never let you feel like you're not enough. You're perfect, Hope. You are everything." I didn't know then how true those promises would have to become. What I did know was that my life had just changed forever, and nothing would ever be the same. Part 2. The storm at home. When the hospital finally discharged me in Hope, I was a mix of emotions, exhausted, nervous, and cautiously hopeful. Eric had barely been in touch since he stormed out of the delivery room. A single text, "I'll pick you up when you're ready," was all I'd received. I wanted to believe he'd had time to process everything, that the shock of becoming a father to a baby girl had worn off. He pulled up outside the hospital, his car idling at the curb. I shuffled outside with Hope bundled in my arms, clutching her tightly as if she were my shield. Eric didn't even get out of the car. He just sat there, one hand on the wheel, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. When I climbed into the passenger seat, I waited for him to say something, to ask about Hope, to tell me she was beautiful, anything. Instead he said, "Do we have everything? Let's go." I glanced down at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her car seat, and then at Eric, who didn't even glance at her. My stomach twisted into a knot. The drive home was silent except for the faint hum of the engine. I tried to break the tension. "She barely cried during the night," I said softly. "The nurses said she's really calm for a newborn." Eric grunted. A grunt. That was the extent of his interest in his own child. When we arrived home, I carried Hope inside, setting her car seat gently on the couch. Eric followed behind, muttering something under his breath about being tired. As I unbuckled Hope, he stood in the doorway, watching me with that same look of disdain I'd seen in the hospital. "Are you really not going to hold her?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Eric, she's your daughter." He scoffed, his lip curling. "Daughter? That's the problem," he said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "What am I supposed to do with a girl?" I stared at him, stunned. "She's not just a girl, she's our girl. She's healthy and perfect, and you should be thanking God for that." Eric shook his head, his hands balling into fists. "I wanted a son. Someone who could carry my name, someone I could teach sports, business, life. What am I supposed to teach a girl? How to braid her hair? My blood boiled. She's a baby. She doesn't need you to teach her anything right now. She needs you to love her. Is that really so hard? Eric's response was swift and cruel. You don't get it, do you? I married you because I thought you'd give me a family. A real family. And now you've ruined it. The words hit me like a slap to the face. My hands trembled as I reached down to pick up Hope, cradling her against my chest. How dare you? I whispered, my voice shaking with anger. How dare you say that about your own child? You don't deserve her. And that's when he snapped. He lunged forward, his hand colliding with my cheek in a stinging slap that sent me stumbling back. The shock of it froze me in place for a moment, but when I looked up at him, my vision blurred with tears. I saw no regret in his eyes. Just rage. Get out, he said, his voice cold and sharp. Take her and leave. I don't want to see either of you again. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but one look at Hope, innocent, fragile, and completely unaware of the chaos around her, kept me grounded. Without another word, I turned and walked to the door, clutching my daughter tightly. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I realized I had nowhere to go. My family was hours away, and I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had just happened. The weight of everything crashed down on me, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. But then Hope stirred in my arms, letting out a tiny whimper, and I knew I couldn't fall apart. Not now. Not for her. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and called the only person I could think of. Carla, I whispered when she picked up. Can you come get me? I need help. Of course, Carla said without hesitation. Where are you? As I waited for her to arrive, I sat on the curb with Hope, rocking her gently and whispering promises I wasn't sure I knew how to keep. It's just us now, sweet girl, I said softly. But I'll protect you. I'll always protect you. When Carla pulled up minutes later, she didn't ask any questions. She just hugged me, took Hope from my arms and said, You're staying with me. As we drove away from the house I'd once thought of as my home, I glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the dark silhouette of the place where everything had fallen apart. Place I never wanted to return to. And so began my journey into the unknown, with nothing but a newborn in my arms and a fire in my heart to create a better life for us both. Part 3, starting over. Carla's house was small but warm, the kind of place where you immediately felt safe. As soon as we walked in, she set a kettle on the stove and gestured for me to sit on the couch. She cradled Hope like a natural, cooing at her tiny face while I sat there, staring blankly at the floor. Start from the beginning, Carla said softly, settling next to me with Hope still in her arms. It all came tumbling out. The slap, the cruel words, the way Eric had walked out of the delivery room and rejected his own daughter. I didn't sugarcoat anything. Carla listened quietly, her jaw tightening with every word, her eyes growing darker. When I finished, her voice was low but firm. You're not going back to him. Ever. I nodded. I know, I whispered. But what do I do now? I have no job, no savings. I can't live here forever, Carla. First of all, you're not going to think about forever right now, she said, placing a hand on my knee. You're going to think about today. And today you're going to let me help you. Carla's kindness was overwhelming. She set up a makeshift nursery in her spare room with an old bassinet she had kept from her sister's baby. She stocked her kitchen with formula and diapers, refusing to let me pay her back. You'll pay me back by getting back on your feet, she said. And by loving that little girl with everything you have. But starting over wasn't easy. The first few days were a blur of exhaustion and fear. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Eric's face twisted with rage. I kept expecting him to show up, pounding on Carla's door, demanding that I come back. Carla insisted I file for a restraining order, and though it terrified me, I agreed. The process was humiliating. Recounting the abuse to strangers, filling out endless paperwork, feeling like I was exposing every inch of my life. But when the judge granted the order, I felt a small measure of relief. Then came the practical challenges. I had left Eric with nothing but the clothes on my back and Hope in my arms. My bank account was nearly empty, and I had no idea how I was going to provide for her. Carla, ever the problem solver, sat me down one night with a notebook and a pen. Let's make a plan, she said. What do you want to do? What kind of job are you looking for? I hesitated. Before Hope, I'd worked as an administrative assistant, but the thought of going back to that felt wrong. I wanted something more stable, something that could truly support us. I don't know, I admitted. But I'll do anything. Over the next few weeks, Carla helped me update my resume and apply for jobs. She even watched Hope during interviews, rocking her to sleep and sending me pictures to keep me calm. Finally, I landed a job as a receptionist at a local clinic. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work with good benefits. I cried when they offered me the position, not just out of relief but because it felt like the first step toward reclaiming my independence. But the biggest challenge wasn't finding work or a place to stay. It was learning to believe in myself again. Eric's words had done more damage than I cared to admit. I replayed them in my mind constantly, wondering if he was right. Was I a failure for not giving him a son? Was I enough for Hope? One night I sat in Carla's living room, holding Hope while she slept. Her tiny fingers curled around mine, her little chest rising and falling with each breath. As I stared at her, tears streamed down my face. "You don't know it yet," I whispered to her. "But you've saved me. You're the reason I'm going to figure this out. I don't care what Eric thinks. I don't care what anyone thinks. I'm going to give you the life you deserve." Carla walked in and caught me mid-sob. She didn't say a word, just sat down beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "You're doing great," she said quietly. "I'm so proud of you." Those words stayed with me. They became my mantra on the hard days, when the bills piled up and the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. Bit by bit, I began to rebuild. I found a small apartment not far from Carla's house, a modest one-bedroom where Hope and I could start fresh. I furnished it with second-hand items from thrift stores and donations from friends. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I also started therapy, encouraged by Carla, who insisted I needed to heal from the trauma of Eric's abuse. At first I resisted, convinced I could handle it on my own. But sitting in that room talking to someone who didn't judge me or pity me felt like a weight lifting off my chest. Every day brought its own challenges, but it also brought moments of joy. Hope's first smile, her tiny laugh, the way her eyes lit up when I sang to her. She reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there was light. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to live. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I might actually be okay. Part 4. The unexpected support. When word got out about what Eric had done, I was bracing for judgment. People always have opinions, and I was terrified they'd say I should have tried harder to fix things, to be a better wife, or to somehow earn Eric's love. I was prepared to carry the shame alone, just as I had carried the weight of his rejection. But instead of judgment, something miraculous happened. It started with a knock on Carla's door one evening. I opened it to find Eric's parents standing there, their faces etched with sadness and regret. "May we come in?" his mother Linda asked softly. Carla was in the kitchen, and I could feel her eyes on me as I stepped aside to let them in. Linda immediately enveloped me in a hug, her arms trembling as she held me tightly. "We're so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We had no idea." Eric's father, Robert, stood behind her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked at me, then at Hope, who was sitting in her bassinet, babbling softly to herself. Can we meet her?" he asked, his voice gruff. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I could trust them. But then I saw the tears in Robert's eyes, and something in me softened. "Her name is Hope," I said quietly, picking her up and holding her close. Linda reached out, her hands trembling as she gently touched Hope's tiny fingers. "She's beautiful," she said, her voice full of wonder. "Eric doesn't deserve her. Or you." Hearing those words from Eric's mother was both validating and heartbreaking. I had spent years trying to earn Eric's approval, to be enough for him. And here was his own mother telling me what I'd long suspected. The problem wasn't me. They stayed for hours listening as I recounted everything that had happened. The slap, the cruel words, the night he threw me out. Linda cried openly, while Robert's expression hardened with every detail. "That's not the man we raised," Robert said finally, his voice thick with anger. "I don't know what's happened to him, but this is unforgivable." They promised to support me in any way they could, from helping with diapers and formula to testifying on my behalf in the custody battle. When they left, Linda hugged me again, whispering, "You're stronger than you know. Don't let him take that from you." Their visit was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more people reached out, friends, coworkers, even neighbors I barely knew. Some dropped off baby clothes or meals, while others simply offered kind words and encouragement. One day, I opened my mailbox to find an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "I heard about what happened. I can't imagine how hard this must be. But please know you're not alone. You're doing an incredible job, and your daughter is lucky to have you. Enclosed is a little something to help." Tucked inside was $200 in cash. I cried for hours, overwhelmed by the kindness of a stranger. Even more surprising was the reaction from Eric's closest friends. A group of them showed up at Carla's house one afternoon, led by his best friend Mark. I hadn't seen them since before Hope was born, and I wasn't sure what to expect. "We came to say we're sorry," Mark said, his expression serious. "We had no idea Eric was capable of this. If we'd known, we would have stepped in sooner." Mark and the others offered to help in any way they could, from moving furniture into my new apartment to watching Hope while I went to job interviews. Mark even offered to connect me with a lawyer he knew, someone who specialized in custody cases. At first, I felt guilty accepting so much help. I wasn't used to relying on others, especially after years of being made to feel like I had to handle everything on my own. But Carla reminded me that people weren't helping out of pity. They genuinely cared. "They see how strong you are," she said one night as we folded Hope's tiny clothes together. "They just want to make sure you don't have to carry everything by yourself." As the weeks turned into months, the support I received became a lifeline. It wasn't just the practical help, though that was invaluable, but the emotional reassurance that I wasn't alone. When I finally moved into my new apartment, Mark and Eric's parents helped me set everything up. Linda cried as she held Hope, promising to visit often. Robert gave me a hug before he left, something he'd never done before. "You're going to be okay," he said simply. "You already are." Their words stayed with me, bolstering me on the hard days when the fear and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. The outpouring of support wasn't just a lifeline. It was a reminder that Eric's rejection didn't define me. I wasn't just the woman he threw out. I was Hope's mother, a friend, a survivor, and someone worthy of love and kindness. And for the first time I started to believe it. Part 5. Facing him again. I had hoped that Eric would simply disappear from our lives after throwing us out. For months he stayed silent, and I began to believe he was content to pretend we didn't exist. But just as I started to settle into my new life, a letter arrived, a court summons. Eric was contesting custody. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my shaking hands, disbelief coursing through me. After everything he'd done, abandoning his newborn daughter, rejecting her existence, and abusing me, he wanted to fight for parental rights? My anger bubbled over as I slammed the letter onto the table. "Why now?" I demanded aloud, though no one was there to answer. "What does he even want?" Carla found me in that state when she came home from work. She read the letter, her face hardening. "This isn't about Hope," she said firmly. "He doesn't care about her. This is about control. He can't stand that you're moving on without him." Her words hit me like a bolt of truth. This wasn't about fatherhood, it was about punishing me for leaving, for daring to stand up to him. I called Mark, who immediately put me in touch with the lawyer he'd mentioned. Her name was Rachel, and she was exactly who I needed. Sharp, experienced, and compassionate. When I explained the situation to her, she didn't flinch. "He doesn't have a leg to stand on," Rachel assured me. "With the evidence of his abuse and the fact that he hasn't been involved in Hope's life, we can make a strong case for full custody. But you need to be prepared. He's going to play dirty." And he did. In court, Eric painted himself as the victim. He claimed I had overreacted to a misunderstanding and had unfairly kept him from seeing his daughter. He even had the audacity to say he'd been looking forward to fatherhood, spinning a story so far from the truth that I barely recognized the man he described. But Rachel was ready for him. She presented the restraining order, detailed my medical records from the night he slapped me, and called Linda and Robert to testify. Watching Eric's own parents condemn his behavior in court was both heartbreaking and vindicating. "Eric has always struggled with anger," Linda admitted on the stand, her voice trembling. "But what he did to his wife and daughter is beyond anything we could have imagined. He doesn't deserve to be in Hope's life. Not until he takes responsibility for his actions." Robert was even more blunt. "He threw away the best thing in his life because of his own selfishness. Hope deserves better than that." The judge seemed to see through Eric's lies, but it didn't stop him from lashing out. During one particularly heated moment, he stood up and shouted, "She's turning everyone against me. This is all her fault." The judge's gavel slammed down, and Eric was ordered to sit. But his outburst only solidified what Rachel and I already knew. This wasn't about Hope. It was about his pride. When the ruling finally came down, it felt like time slowed. The judge awarded me full custody, citing Eric's history of abusive behavior and lack of involvement in Hope's life. He was granted supervised visitation, but only after completing anger management and therapy. As we left the courtroom, Eric glared at me with pure venom in his eyes. "You think you've won," he hissed. "But this isn't over." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had hope in my arms, and that was all that mattered. The aftermath. The weeks following the court ruling were a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, triumph, and lingering fear all swirled together as I tried to process what had happened. Eric called me once after the court date, but I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, his voice dripping with fake remorse. "I just want to see my daughter," he said. "Can we work something out?" I deleted it without replying. I knew better than to believe him. Linda and Robert, on the other hand, became regular fixtures in Hope's life. They visited often, bringing gifts and helping out however they could. It was bittersweet, watching them love Hope so deeply while knowing their son had rejected her. One afternoon, Linda sat with me on the couch while Hope played on the floor with blocks. "I'm sorry for what Eric put you through," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "We didn't see the warning signs. We should have done more." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You've done more than enough," I said. "You've shown up for her in a way he never did. That means everything." Finding strength. Facing Eric again was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it taught me something important. I was stronger than I thought. The fear he had planted in me didn't control me anymore. Hope was my reason to keep going, to keep fighting. Every time she smiled or reached for me, I was reminded of why I had to stay strong. The confrontation with Eric had closed one chapter of my life. A dark, painful chapter one was glad to leave behind. Now it was time to write a new one. A chapter filled with hope. Part 6. A new beginning. 2 years later, my life looks completely different. The woman who stood on Carla's doorstep, clutching her newborn and trembling with fear, feels like a stranger. I've come so far from that moment, and while the journey wasn't easy, every step was worth it. Hope is a lively, curious toddler now with big bright eyes and a laugh that lights up any room. She's the reason I get out of bed every morning, even when life feels overwhelming. Her first word was "Mama," and every time she says it, I'm reminded of how far we've come. We still live in the little apartment I moved into after leaving Eric. It's not much, but it's filled with warmth and love. The walls are covered with photos of Hope's milestones: her first smile, her first birthday, her first steps. There's even a messy finger painting she made taped to the fridge. A swirl of bright colors that always makes me smile. I found a new sense of independence, too. My job at the clinic has grown into more than just a paycheck. Over time, I built strong relationships with my coworkers, and when an administrative management position opened up, I went for it. The confidence I felt walking into that interview was something I hadn't experienced in years, and when they offered me the job, I cried tears of pride instead of pain for the first time in what felt like forever. But the most surprising part of this new beginning? I've started to find peace, not just in my life but in my heart. For a long time, I held on to anger toward Eric. I replayed his words, his slap, the moment he turned his back on our daughter. It consumed me, keeping me up at night, making me question my own worth. Therapy helped me let go of that anger little by little. My therapist once told me, "Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you. You don't have to excuse what he did, but you can release the power it holds over you." First, I resisted. Forgive Eric? After everything he'd done? But I realized she was right. Holding on to that anger didn't hurt Eric, it hurt me. Letting it go didn't mean I had to forget, and it certainly didn't mean I wanted him back in our lives. It meant I could finally move forward, free from the chains of the past. Eric, for his part, hasn't changed much. He attended a few therapy sessions to fulfill the court's requirements but didn't stick with it. He was granted supervised visitation, but after a few half-hearted attempts to meet with Hope, he disappeared again. The last time he saw her, she was just a baby, too young to remember him. Part of me is relieved. I don't want her to grow up with the weight of his rejection or the scars of his anger. Linda and Robert have filled the gap, showering her with love and affection every chance they get. They visit us often, bringing books and toys for Hope, and helping me with a never-ending list of parenting tasks. One evening, while Linda was reading Hope a bedtime story, she turned to me and said, "You're doing an amazing job, you know that? She's so happy, and that's all because of you." I smiled, tears threatening to spill over. "I'm just trying to give her the life she deserves." Linda reached over and squeezed my hand. "You already have. But my new beginning isn't just about Hope. It's about me, too. I've started to rediscover the person I was before Eric, before the fear and self-doubt took over. I've joined a hiking group, something I used to love but gave up when Eric said it was a waste of time. I've made new friends, taken up painting again, and even started a savings account for a house. And then there's the unexpected, love. A few months ago I met someone. His name is Daniel and he's different. Kind, patient, understanding. He knows my story, every painful detail, and he didn't run. Instead he listened, holding space for my fears and offering gentle reminders that not everyone is like Eric. The first time he met Hope I was terrified. But she took to him immediately, showing him her favorite book and tugging him toward her toy box. Watching them together filled me with a cautious kind of hope, the kind that whispers, maybe it's okay to trust again. I'm not rushing into anything though. This time, I'm taking it slow, listening to my instincts, and putting hope in myself first. The past will always be a part of my story, but it doesn't define me anymore. It's a chapter I've left behind, and now I'm writing a new one filled with love, laughter, and a future that feels bright. A letter to Hope. Sometimes, late at night, I write letters to Hope for her to read when she's older. Here's the one I wrote most recently. Dear Hope, when you're old enough to read this, I want you to know something important. You saved me. You don't remember it, but there was a time when I didn't know if I could keep going. And then you came into my life and everything changed. You gave me a reason to fight, to heal, to dream again. You are my light, my heart, and my greatest gift. No matter what happens in life, I want you to remember this. You are enough. You always have been and you always will be. You are loved more than you'll ever know. Love always, Mom. And that's where I am now, living for today, dreaming of tomorrow, and holding on to the strength that carried me through it all. Question for readers. Have you ever had to start over after a betrayal or heartbreak? How did you find the strength to rebuild your life? If you were in my shoes, what would you have done after being kicked out? Do you think people like Eric can ever truly change?